Well, I didn't know how many of you were going to show up. But since these are the home counties of liberty, I'm not surprised. This is, after all, where Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And if we can't stand up here, I don't know from whence come the well springs of American freedom's renewal in this country. So thank you for being here this evening. My name is Marion Smith. I'm president of the Common Sense Society, and I in particular want to thank the Virginia Council and John Reed, more on him in moments, for their efforts in organizing this evening. A quick word about Common Sense Society. We exist to promote liberty, prosperity, and beauty, and we do that through civic education programs for middle and high school students, curricular resources for them, teacher trainings, collegiate events. This week we had Douglas Murray in the campus of UVA, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and Wofford College, South Carolina. We also offer opportunities for continuing education for young scholars and young professionals, and encourage you to visit our website to discover more about those fellowship opportunities. And crucially, we're also supporting civic engagement efforts to make sure that in a Tocquevillian fashion, local citizens are taking responsibility for their own affairs, because in the vacuum or the void of us not doing so, lots of forces who don't have our best interest at heart are willing to do so. I believe there are only two ways to get anybody to do anything: persuasion or coercion. And when people run out of words, they pick up instruments of coercion and sometimes violence. What has happened to this beautiful city of Richmond in the last few years is reminiscent of what you see in war zones around the world, and it must not stand. I'm a proud native of South Carolina, but I'm now a Virginia resident. And so this is also personal for me. Why destroy our history? Without a memory of yesterday, there can be no vision for the future. And without a vision, the people perish. No one has more heroically, effectively, and often humorously connected these dots than our guest speaker tonight. He is associate editor at the Spectator. He also writes for the New York Post, which had him most recently on the front lines of the conflict in Ukraine. He's the author of 7 books, including most recently War on the West, and the #1 international bestseller, The Madness of Crowds, which I commend to you to help us understand some of what we're living through today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Douglas Murray.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction and warm welcome. Thank you to Marion and to the Common Sense Society for inviting me here, and thank you to all of you for turning out for what I hope will be a very enjoyable evening and indeed discussion. John Reed and I will be discussing immediately afterwards, and I hope you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well. It's a great pleasure for me to be in Richmond. It's actually my first time, so especially a pleasure for me. And I said to my friends, colleagues earlier, I particularly want to go to see Monument Avenue. Or Empty Plinth Avenue, as it should obviously be renamed. As you can probably tell from my accent, I was born in the UK, in London. And in Britain, we don't really learn any American history, much like America. But we really don't learn any American history. The late Jessica Mitford once said, mid-20th century writer, said that even then, the 20th century, the teaching of American history in Britain essentially was left as a sort of unpleasant thing we didn't talk about. That something had happened, the Americans had done something bad, and it's best not to discuss it. I've been very lucky in recent years to actually have the opportunity and time to investigate and to read up on and speak to people about American history myself. And it's been, of course, as everyone here knows, one of the great intellectual journeys of discovery that anyone can embark upon. Never complete it, but you can embark upon it. And in recent years, that's focused in particular on two things that have taken up my time. One is my most recent book that Marion was kind enough to mention, The War on the West. And the second is a 10-episode series I made called Uncanceled History, which you can see on YouTube and any other platform, where I interviewed 10 leading historians, leading American historians almost entirely, talking in depth about some of the figures who have been talked about so glibly in recent years here in America. For me personally, it was an enormous opportunity to speak with scholars like Alan Gelzo, Gene Yarbrough, some of the great minds of American scholarship about the true complex story, not the simplistic story. There were times in all of our past when we had one simplistic story about our past, and we've entered an age where we have a new, deeply simplistic story about our past. And all of these scholars, of course, have the dexterity and the honesty, which is something I'll come back to look at these historical issues in the round. Now, I actually moved to America a few years ago, became a New Yorker. I was the only human being to move to New York in 2020. A salmon-like movement upriver as everyone else was going the other way. But one of the things that struck me when I arrived, one of the first things that happened actually was that in the New York City Council chamber, the statue of Thomas Jefferson was voted by the council to be removed. And it was duly removed. It was winched down from the position it had been in since the 1830s. It was boxed up, crated up, and wheeled out a back door. And we covered this, obviously, at the New York Post, and one of my colleagues spoke to one of the council members who had voted for the removal of Thomas Jefferson's statue, and she said, well, Thomas Jefferson does not represent our values. Which I found very interesting, because, of course, if Thomas Jefferson doesn't represent your values in America, then the question arises, who exactly does? And I would expect that if this councilwoman was capable of being honest, she might say, well, me, obviously. What I'm saying is that to a great extent, if you deracinate the entire historical landscape, what is there left but the glorious me, the presentism, the todayism? The question that I had in 2020, and which I partly address in The War on the West, is once a movement of historical revisionism of the kind we've seen in recent years begins, how confident can you be that anyone knows where the brakes are on this thing? And I would say that for many of us, it became clear very fast that there were no brakes, or at least if there were, no one knew where they were. In very short order, the iconoclastic fever of that year turned from Confederate statues to statues of all the founding fathers, to Columbus, obviously, deeply guilty historical figure, should never have set out. Would have been best if he'd never stumbled upon America, or had gone back home and told the Europeans there was nothing there. It went all the way to, of course, I mean, not just figures on the South in the Civil War, but figures on the North. I was in Portland in 2020 with Antifa when they pulled down the statue of Abraham Lincoln, so it's the South and the North. Theodore Roosevelt's statue came down in New York, partly voted by his own great-grandson, an easy rider, as one of TR's biographers said to me. In fact, when I spoke to Theodore Roosevelt's biographer, I said to him, you know, you're the defender of only the third most wanted man on Mount Rushmore. But with all of these cases, you just thought, where exactly are the brakes on this thing? And in my own country of birth, in Britain, in London, when we had protests that mirrored the American protests in the summer of 2020, in no time we had attacks on the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square, and on the Cenotaph, which is the national memorial to the dead of the two world wars. And something that struck me about this, struck me when I was doing this series, Uncanceled History, was the similarity of the question, the answer I got from a number of historians on a number of these figures. You see, it had always been my view that if you wanted to win hearts and minds, as it were, and we'll come back to whether or not certain people do at the moment, but if you want to win hearts and minds, why would you rush straight for the holiest places of a culture? Why would you go for Jefferson so relentlessly? Why would you go for Lincoln so relentlessly? Why would you go for Churchill? And on each of these occasions, the scholars and historians who I asked this of said something very similar. They said, because to attack these people is to attack the heart of us, the heart of the country. You see, if you attack Churchill, you attack the British people's sense of pride, their sense that we did something good. If you attack all of the founding fathers, all of the great figures of American history, you attack the sense in every American that there's something good about this country, that our forebears achieved something. So the target seemed to me to be much more carefully chosen than some people have thought. Now, why did it happen? The first is, of course, and it should always be stated, that the simple presence of violence, actual and implied, is always worryingly successful, even in a free society. Even the intimidation, the intimation that if things don't go your way, you might become violent, even that can have a huge effect in dampening a society down, in making people cower, in making them move away, in making themselves not want to stand out as a kind of target. But the second thing that struck me was that part of this movement had such success in its iconoclastic fury because it was speaking into what was a considerable void of ignorance that existed in this country and other countries around the world. Too many people in America seemed to have lost the knowledge of their own story. Too many people seemed not to know how to defend the arguments against the most vociferous critics in the land. I found it strange, by the way, this process of iconoclasm, for the following reasons. I'll give you a couple of comparisons which might throw some light on this. In my own country of birth, in Great Britain, we had our own civil war, a couple of centuries before yours. And monuments to that are all over the country. And they're not hidden, and they're not controversial. Outside Parliament in Westminster stands a statue of Oliver Cromwell. Now, he isn't loved by everybody, particularly not people from Ireland. But outside Parliament stands a statue of Oliver Cromwell. Why? Well, he won the Civil War. He protected Parliament against the power of the king. At the other end of Whitehall, the other end of Downing Street, is a statue of King Charles I, who Oliver Cromwell beheaded. There's a great equestrian statue, a statue of King Charles I on horseback. It's been there for centuries. And in actual fact, fans of the minutiae of British history might be interested to know that the statue of Oliver Cromwell in Westminster is actually staring right across at the Church of St. Margaret's, Westminster, above the east porch, above which is a bust of Charles I. Even now, all of these centuries later, the two men in marble stare across at each other. It raises the question. It raises the question of what our attitude should be towards the past, what it is. And I think an enormous misunderstanding that has gone on in recent years, that all of the things from the past that we inherit must mean that we worship and revere, rather than preserve, protect, debate, discuss, are reminded of, are reminded by, and much more. See, one of the views I came to in recent years was that it's very unwise for anyone to impose a version of history onto other people when it is their history. It's unwise within a country, unwise from country to country. Let me give an example of why. I think that if a local community wants to take down a statue, they should take it down, but that it's very unwise for outsiders to do such a thing. Let me give another example from home. In Britain, Napoleon Bonaparte is regarded as a precursor to the dictators of the 20th century. We regard him still in a very negative light. Read the speeches of William Pitt against Napoleon, and you read the echoes that will reverberate a couple of centuries later from Churchill about Adolf Hitler. Now, if you go to Paris, which is only a couple of hours train ride away, you will find a very different attitude towards Napoleon. I once was doing a project with NATO generals many years ago, and I remember that the French admiral, the head of the French military, came over to me one lunchtime, and he said, is it, I won't do my French accent, it's terrible. He said, can it be true, Douglas, that in British schools you teach that Napoleon was a dictator? I said, I'm afraid it is true, Admiral. I'm afraid it is true. He was just, zut alors, this is unbelievable. He couldn't believe it, because obviously in France you have huge monuments to Napoleon. As I say, if the British attitude of and about Napoleon was carried a little way across the English Channel, we would be at war with France again, and vice versa. So we actually can cope with people making their own decisions about the past and what they want to live around and among, and this should be an ongoing discussion. There's no reason why once something goes up, it should stay up forever, but nor is there any reason just because some people want something to come down, it should come down. The second thing is, it seems to me, the importance of what has become known in the museum world as retain and explain. There is no reason why a historical artifact that some people find offensive, that some people have criticisms of, cannot stay where it is and be explained. You don't even have to have a plaque attacking it. You can just explain the context of it. And I was very struck when I was interviewing, one of the interviews I did in this Uncanceled History series that stuck with me the most was an interview I did with a biographer of General Lee. I went in not knowing all that much about Lee. I'd read a couple of biographies, but one of his biographers, Jonathan Horne, he wrote a book called The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, which is a very fine biography of Lee that came out in 2014. One of the things that he pointed out to me was, he said, as you see the monuments of all sorts of figures coming down across America, you wonder what a couple of generations from now is the American story that people will hear. Jonathan Horne said that he'd recently heard a scholar saying, I look forward to taking a trip across the country soon and seeing, the story of America. And Horne, who's by no means an unadulterated admirer of Lee, just said, my question is, what story are you going to learn? What story are you going to learn if you don't realize the complexity of the history, if you don't realize the dark edges of it and the bright parts? What exactly are you going to get? Now, the third thing, it seems to me, that's very obvious in this is that the last few years have demonstrated that all of us need to know more. I include myself in that. All of us need to know more. It seems to me that a significant portion of America, like the British, was sort of blindsided by the historical fury that erupted at various points in the last decade, and particularly in 2020. They were blindsided because of the extremity of some of the claims, the willingness of people to use not just violence, but very violent language against anyone who disagreed with them. And they were blindsided by the throwing out of historical claims that were not able to be defended, but which were left hanging in the air. And I want to address this for a moment. I want to address three people in particular. It's been my contention, as I've been speaking to students this week, that we need to come up with a term. The term we need to come up with is the opposite of a public intellectual. You see, if I asked you to imagine what you had in your mind when you thought of a public intellectual in America, I would have thought, like me, people would come to mind like James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, Gore Vidal, a whole range of people with different opinions and backgrounds and much more. If you asked me what a public debate looked like in America, I would think of Norman Mailer writing about feminism and having to defend his views to three very, very good at defending themselves feminists in the town hall in New York, something you can see in the documentary Town Bloody Hall. And did they give Norman Mailer a bloody time? That was what you had to do in America. In fact, that's what you had to do throughout American history, from the founding onwards. It's why Lincoln put such effort into the Lincoln-Douglas debates and put such effort into making sure that the transcripts were correct, because he knew that you had to win arguments in public. You couldn't just put ideas out there, especially highly inflammatory ideas, and just say, I'm not going to debate them. I don't believe in giving a platform to people who disagree with me. What do we call people who do precisely that? Who put out inflammatory claims and then will not defend them in public? I wanted to quote three people in particular, all of whom I mention at various points in the war on the West. These are examples of what I think is a serious problem in American intellectual and public life. The first is a woman called Robin DiAngelo. Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility, and another book recently called Nice Racism. White Fragility sold, in the months after George Floyd's death, sold about 500,000 copies. Some of you will know that if you can find a bookshop these days, if you went into the bookshop in those months, it was almost the only book you were expected to buy. There's sort of even great piles of them at the till, just in case you'd forgotten to get your 5 fruit and veg a day. DiAngelo is, to my mind, a highly reprehensible figure for the following reason. She puts the most outlandish claims out there and then refuses to defend them. Let me give 2 examples. In her most recent book, Nice Racism, she contends that between 1950 and the present day, there has been no improvement in race relations in America. None at all. By the way, all of the data, as well as I think the evidence of our own lives, shows that that is a quite malicious untruth to spread. To say, no, this generation of Americans in the 2020s has the same attitudes about race as Americans did in the 1950s. But that is what she claims in Nice Racism. Now, in her previous book, White Fragility, she makes even more outlandish claims. And as far as I can see, she put herself forward for interview only once with any depth, and it wasn't very much depth, but a little bit of depth. And that was in 2018. And she appeared on Amanpour and Company, and actual fact, the interviewer that day was not Christian Amanpour herself, but was Michelle Martin, a distinguished black female journalist. And Martin did the job she should do, which was to put the many questions, or at least some of the many questions that should have been put to D'Angelo. Here was one of them. Michelle Martin said to D'Angelo, she quoted something D'Angelo said, where she had said that D'Angelo had said that white people find racism, quote, exciting and enjoy, quote, indulging in it. So Michelle Martin said to Robin DiAngelo, who is white, of course, Michelle Martin said, why do you say that? You're a scholar. Where's your data? What makes you say that? Here is the answer that Robin DiAngelo gave. Quote, there is a kind of glee in the white collective when black bodies are punished. It takes a moment to absorb that claim. A wicked, and again, I think, such an untrue claim. But the thing that struck me about it was this. She had made one outlandish claim and was being asked by a journalist the sort of question you should be asked, which is, what's your data? What's your evidence for this claim? And what she did was she came back with an even more outlandish claim that she couldn't defend either. That has become a modus operandi of certain figures in our time, which I contend is lethal to public life and public debate in America. Let me give a second example, which is the 1619 Project. This week, as it happened, I was weirdly sparring with the coordinator of it, Nicole Hannah-Jones, for repeating another untruth. But this is a project which, if it had not had the backing of the New York Times, I don't think would have got anywhere at all. But if you go through this project, and this is, of course, not just a project of the New York Times, but it's now a book, it's a children's book, it's a series on Hulu, has an enormous cultural impact. The originators of the project said in their founding statement that the project wanted to change the date of the American founding to, quote, our true founding, which they say is 1619. Now, this is what they said in their founding documents. Subsequently, a number of people criticized them for this, said, what are you saying, that our true founding was 1619? And Nicole Hannah-Jones herself said, the 1619 Project does not argue that 1619 is our true founding. At that time, Nicole Hannah-Jones's own Twitter account had a banner with 1776 crossed out and 1619 written over it. All that they did was to remove the words "our true founding" silently from their own website in the hope that nobody would notice. A quite extraordinarily dishonest tactic for a paper of record to engage in. To say something that inflammatory, then to quietly edit it and pretend they'd never said it, even whilst they were saying it. A second example of the extraordinary claims that Hannah-Jones and her colleagues made was that the reason why America sought independence was essentially almost entirely because of the issue of slavery, and that America wanted to continue slaving and that Britain didn't. This is such a historically inept claim to make, but allow me for a moment to point out why. She cites, or she and her team cite, two legal cases. One of them is Somerset versus Stewart. This was a British legal case that had absolutely no legal binding in America at the time, none. What is odder is that the authors of the 1619 Project look at all sorts of reasons they think explain American independence, and at no point do they take into account the Declaration of Independence. They don't seem to think that the Declaration of Independence might be a suggestive document when talking about the Independence Declaration. But I wanted to give a third example of, I think, the wild claims put out by this project and why they are so damaging. One of the claims made in the project is an attack on capitalism. By the way, Nicole Hannah-Jones claims that the authors of the 1619 project are historians. In fact, a lot of them are simply not. The chapter on capitalism is written by a sociologist called Matthew Desmond, and with apologies to any sociologists in the room, he's about as adept at dealing with the issue as you would expect a sociologist to be. Matthew Desmond claims that the capitalist system is, from its basis, connected to slavery. This is what he says. He says that in modern corporations, people track, record, and analyze via vertical reporting systems, double-entry bookkeeping, and precise quantification. He goes on, many of these techniques that we now take for granted were developed by and for large plantations. Now, to put it politely, this is a wildly historically ignorant claim. Correct categories of analysis and bookkeeping go back to ancient Babylon, among many other places. The claim that he makes that when the average American worker sits down, and this is literally what he says, that they sit down to their Microsoft Excel sheet, they are sitting in a direct path from the slaveholders, is not just to make a historically inept claim. It is, among other things, to forget that there might be a reason why systems that believe in tracking, recording, and analyzing might work better than systems, say, in which things are lost, ignored, and forgotten about. But he also makes the fundamental error of assuming that the plantations were a system of capitalism, free markets, when any historian could explain to him that they represented, in all their evil, something much closer to a feudal system, something like the system that was going on in Russia with serfs at the time. So these were very maliciously untrue claims which were thrown out there and which many people simply didn't know how to push back against. I said I wanted to give a third example, and bear with me. The third example I wanted to focus on of somebody who throws out claims and will not defend them in public. Again, like D'Angelo and Hannah-Jones, simply will not go against somebody who disagrees with his views, is the author Ibram X. Kendi. Now, his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, has all sorts of claims in it. It's a very interesting read in many ways. And Kendi is a talented polemicist. What he is not is an honest historian. And one example I would give is this, his treatment of Thomas Jefferson, who I think appears only once, if I remember rightly, in the book. In How to Be an Anti-Racist, which, like White Fragility, was piled up in the bookstores from 2020 onwards, Kendi claims that Thomas Jefferson was racist and gives us an example. This is what he says. He says, Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration. Now, first of all, this is a category error of a quite incredible kind. The anti-racist declaration that Kendi is talking about is a declaration of Kendi's own creation, created in 2019. One should not blame Thomas Jefferson for failing to make a declaration that was first made 2 centuries after he was writing. But that's what Kendi does. He says, Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration. Indeed, he said that he failed to say that all racial groups are equals, and says it would be hazardous to affirm that equally cultivated, the different races would not become equals. Now, this I was very struck by when I first read it in Kendi's book, because I'm very struck when people quote historical passages like this, and I want to chase them down and discover that the author himself hasn't chased down the thing he's quoting. Kendi is quoting a book on racism in America, and actually doesn't even quote the source. The source, this is the reason I think why he doesn't quote it, The source you can find very easily in the archives at Monticello. The source is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1785 to his friend the Marquis de Chastellux, a French friend of his, obviously. And to know the following story is to learn something very important about the approach we ought to have towards history. Because it's so easy to take the current view that we should stand as effectively judge, jury, and executioner over the past, to find everybody in the past wanting because they don't share the particular views we hold in 2023. You can effectively find everyone guilty of the cardinal sins of being, among other things, a dead white male, something which always amuses me because the people who say it talk about being white as being awful, being male as being terrible, and being dead as being a real loser thing to do. Like, who would do that? On top of everything else, they died. Anyhow, this is a very interesting example of one of the historical mistakes we're making at the moment. At the time that Thomas Jefferson was alive and working, there were many issues that were not solved, just as there are today. But one of the lively debates of his time, it wasn't preoccupying him particularly, but it was in the background, was a debate which wasn't actually solved for decades after his death. It wasn't solved until the 19th century. But for people who are interested in historical arguments of now great oddity, one of the arguments that was going on in Jefferson's day was an argument about so-called monogenesis and homogenesis. Monogenesis was the belief that all human beings were related. We effectively all came from the same stock, which we now know, of course, is true. We've known since the 19th century. However, in the 18th century, people didn't know about this, and it was a lively debate. People weren't sure if we were all descended from the same stock or from different stock, effectively. And the people who thought it was different stock were known as polygenicists. The polygenicists got themselves into all sorts of intellectual rabbit holes. It's quite amusing, actually, to read some of the problems they got into, because if you believed in polygenesis, among other things, you had to work out, well, does that mean there was a white Adam and Eve, and a black Adam and Eve, and a Chinese Adam and Eve, and all these different Edens, and if so, where were they, and why did God do that? You can see the sort of problems they were getting themselves into, but that was because people were working this out. Now, Thomas Jefferson, in the letter that Kendi refers to from 1785, actually says something quite remarkable. He is saying this in a private letter to his friend, and this letter that is used against him by Kendi, Jefferson actually says the following. He says, quote, "I believe the Indian," by which he means Native American, "to be in body and mind equal to the white man. I have supposed the black man in his present state might not be so, but it would be hazardous to affirm that, equally cultivated for a few generations, he would not become so." So what Jefferson is saying is, I don't know, but it seems to me that the evidence is that given the same education, the same opportunities and everything else, actually we turn out the same. Which might not seem to be an enormously progressive or enlightened view today, but in the 1780s was radically enlightened. So I give these examples because these are the sort of barrages that have come across all of our bows in recent years and have been, to a great extent, unanswered, partly because people haven't had the ammunition to answer them, and partly because the people throwing out the claims refuse to defend them in public. So, what are we to do? The first seems to me to try to know and learn more about our past. Some people try to claim that those of us who are critiquing some of the over-excesses and the overreaches of recent years somehow want to limit the debate. Nothing could be further from my own mind. I want the debate to be as wide and as noisy as possible, but I want there to be a debate. I do not want it to be simply one group of people telling another people to read these books and shut up and accept it, or to say, this is my point of view and it's my way or the highway. I want there to be as wide a debate as possible, but I want it to occur. If that to occur, people will have to engage in it. The second thing that strikes me is that in America in particular, we need to do a much better job of trying to communicate to the next generation the simple luck we have of being in this country. Now, Marion alluded to at the beginning, I spent part of my life, or a lot of my life, traveling all over the world, to many a benighted country, to many a war zone, to many a terrible and destroyed society. You can never be in a place which is being physically destroyed, morally destroyed, without reflecting on your own luck. And sometimes in recent years I've thought about this concept of luck and the fact that in societies like ours, we have trouble with it. In a way, we don't know what to do about it. We feel bad about it sometimes. So we look at the rest of the world and think, gosh, we could have been born there. And it's no one's fault where they're born, it's luck, as it were. But I made this point a few years ago to a parliamentarian in Norway, and when I was there to speak about a book of mine on Europe. And I talked about luck and the problem that modern Western people have about this. And she was a minister in the government, and she said something very interesting to me that stuck with me and really did change my attitude towards this. She said, Douglas, it's not just luck. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, we here in Norway have the same energy reserves as Venezuela. But there is a reason why Venezuela is Venezuela and Norway is Norway. And it's because we have made better decisions, and our predecessors made better decisions. Now, that is a harsh reality, but a true one. If the founders had gone another way even slightly, our luck in America would be very different. I had the great privilege in Thomas Jefferson's own university the other day of seeing some of the documents of Thomas Jefferson's, and seeing, among other things, of course, the signatures on the Declaration of Independence, and realizing that in the heads of all the signatories would have been the memory of what happened to the signatories of Thomas Cromwell's edict to kill the king in the 1640s in England. Everybody who put their names to that document either died before the Restoration or was hounded and executed after the Restoration. When Charles II came back, he actually even went as far as to dig up the body of Oliver Cromwell, have it hang-drawn and quartered and the head put on a spike. People were not nice in those days. And so the founders and the people who signed the Declaration knew that they were doing something exceptionally brave. And I'd add a second thing to this. Consider that at the time, there was only one other state in the world that was escaping the monarchical system, revolutionary France. And consider the fact that when Thomas Jefferson and the other founders, even after the founding, consider the fact that the only other republic in the world went to the terror that Robespierre, Danton, everyone, one by one, had their enemies guillotined and then was guillotined themselves. That the blood literally flowed through the streets of Paris. Consider what they were thinking in cities like this one about the experiment that they were engaging in and its fragility at that time. And if you consider that, you have to say to the people today who have such an unfair estimation of this country and its past, compared to what and compared to where? Compared to what and compared to where? This country seems to me remarkable for lots of reasons, but just two of them are the fact, firstly, that it is a society that is self-critical, that believes in self-criticism. Not all societies do, I can assure you. Not all societies do. And secondly, that it is a country that wants to improve. That wants to improve. That, again, is something that seems to me for my travels, highly unusual. Just before I finish and hand over to Q&A and discussion, I'd say one of my favorite quotes is from the composer Gustav Mahler, who once said that tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. It seems to me that tradition, at the very least, is the passing on to your successors, not of a wasteland, but of the best that you have in a country that has provided the greatest opportunity that humanity has ever known. Thank you.
So you often hear about leading citizens. You read an article and it mentions leading citizens. There are an awful lot of leading citizens in this room. If you're affiliated with the Virginia Council, would you just raise your hand, please? These are leading citizens. To moderate this discussion, we have John Reed, who has spent more than a decade as the voice of reason, dare I say common sense, here in Central Virginia. As the morning and noon co-anchor of Good Morning Richmond on WRIC-ABC, and most recently is the current host of the daily morning drive time talk show Richmond's Morning News. Please join me in welcoming John Reed.
Chair on the right or the left? To the right or the left?
I just automatically
Yes.
Stage right.
I watch whether somebody goes to the right or the left when they have a choice, and I was also very pleased to pass my Joe Biden staircase test on the way up to the stage. I felt like that was important.
You've got to get down as well.
That's true.
So.
Hang out for the next hour. We'll see what happens. I appreciated you joining us on the air on Thursday, and we talked about how you would carve out time before the speech tonight to visit Richmond. I thought I might start by saying, did you get to do that? Mm-hmm. What made the tour, and what was your reaction of, this is your first visit to Richmond?
Yeah, it is, yeah. Well, actually, principally what I mentioned in my remarks, which was Monument Avenue, it seems to me such a, as I say, it's your choice as a city what you do, but it, I mean, it is a very strange thing to see. I mean, I've seen it before in Portland and Seattle and other places, but, you know, a tourist might be interested in coming and seeing a lot of plinths, but don't think it's likely. There's a limited attraction in them, you know. It's sad.
So you rode up Monument Avenue, the former Monument Avenue. Did you stop at the Capitol? Did you see St. John's Church? What else made the list today?
Well, I mean, I've traveled to see a lot of American cities in the last 25 years, and I'm always struck by similar things, which is not least the pride of the civic buildings and the awful feeling, and I hope nobody will take this as an offense, but the horrible feeling that we don't live up to them. You know, that I'm a bit of an architectural elitist, and when I see beautiful buildings which people put up in the 18th and 19th century, I think, well, there's a sign of a proud city, a proud place. When I see them replaced with highly ugly buildings and buildings that effectively say, you know, you don't matter, you the person, it's a distressing thing to see. Somebody told me that even the building beside this hotel, a beautiful building, is going to be pulled down and a car park put in its place. I hope that anyone who has any say in this prevents that from happening. Acts of despoliation like that are exactly what people should stop. Nobody will come to this place to see a car park.
One of the things that I've enjoyed about your podcast and our conversation the other day and your remarks this evening is the historical perspective, which is probably the thing that if you're a communications director for an American politician, you would put that in the speech, and then someone else would come behind you and mark it out and say, we're not talking about history, get on with it, don't waste everyone's time with this, plus it's too controversial. Do you think, as you study the history of the United States and where we are today in 2023, that we are in a normal period of upheaval? I've had a few of my older listeners who said, John, you didn't live through the 60s. I lived through the 60s. So I don't know why you're so exercised about this, because this is similar to that, and we're just riding the roller coaster, and you should calm down about it.
Well, that's a very interesting point, because 68, you could easily say, and some people will remember it, but 68 was, a terrifying period in America for lots of reasons. In those years around it as well, the assassinations, the violence at party conventions and so on campuses, it was a very scary time in America. I think one thing that is striking to me is that, among other things, the similarities between then and now, you'd have to take into account that in 1968 there still was great injustice against blacks in America. Mm-hmm. Great injustice. And so there was some, I don't say that the extremes were by any means defensible, but there was, because the people of peace were the ones who won, as they should always do. But there was a claim, there was a cause there. What is the cause of the people who, for instance, burnt down Ferguson a few years ago? I was in Ferguson last year, and you know what? The lie that was pumped around about what happened in Ferguson, people came from outside and they burnt that place down. I can tell you one thing, Ferguson remains burnt down. You know, the media moved on, the troublemakers moved on, but Ferguson did not. And that is a story I've seen in city after city in America, and it is very distressing to see. You know, people spread lies very fast and spread disingenuous claims about a single incident representing, for instance, all police, then everyone in America, then everyone in the West. And before you know it, you have this stampede over what? What is the actual claim? And on that, there is a considerable silence. The violence is not commensurate with the claims that are being made. The claims are highly abstract, and the violence is not.
Why are we 3 years into this, after the violence of 2020, where everything bubbled up, of course, an election year, so I would posit that was one of the main motivations, was to create an atmosphere where there could be some dramatic change politically. But why are we in 2023 still wrestling with this, and the reasonable voices, the objective analysts still haven't made it to the front of the public? This gathering notwithstanding.
I think one reason is this. A lot of the people, there's a passage in Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals that I quote Nietzsche very carefully, but I quote him in the Genealogy of Morals in this book. A very important phrase he says there, which I lift. He refers somewhere there to people who talk about justice but mean revenge. There are people in American life who claim to be talking about justice but are actually talking about revenge. You get it in different debates in America. There's an extreme form of fourth wave feminism that effectively thinks that because women were undoubtedly oppressed in the past, the thing is to claim that men are trash and we don't need men. So we've seen it in other movements in America. But I think there are people engaged in that here in the United States at the moment who say because the situation was bad for one group in the past or for other groups in the past, we must be very virulently rude and unpleasant and sometimes violent against another group. But that isn't justice at all. That's not equality. That's vengeance. And it worries me deeply that that form of vengeance has become such a normal rhetoric in American life. We nod it by.
I've enjoyed your remarks in the podcast and here. You're very civilized. You present yourself in a dignified way. And I compare that to the rhetoric that we hear from so many people on the left. And I look, perhaps while you were traveling this week, you didn't see this, but Matt Walsh, who I also admire very much, called out a trans activist and was pretty brutal in his assessment of the trans activist. I don't think unfair, but very brutal. And it ignited a discussion on the right of how we handle engagement with people who have been hostile to us and who occasionally do engage in violence, and certainly ugly language. How are you? I mean, you are who you are, and you present yourself one way, but what would your advice be to someone who is mad as hell and isn't going to take it anymore and wants to get into a scuffle, but has been told, now please be calm, be quiet, and don't cross that line?
Well, I can confess my privilege for a moment, something I don't always do, but let me confess my privilege. I'm a writer. I've been a writer all my life, almost 25 years now, since I wrote my first book. And I have a freedom, which is a freedom to explain what I think and why. And I'm fortunate enough to have platforms to do so. Worked pretty hard for it, but I'm fortunate to have platforms to do so. And I do think that's a great privilege. Most people in their lives do not have that privilege, or at least many people do not have that privilege. They worry about what they say more. They worry about saying what they think. They worry about saying what they think in the workplace, around the dinner table, to their families, sometimes to their children or their parents, or to friends, people at their church, or any number of other things. They worry about peer pressure. I don't have to worry about that, you see. I've never particularly cared if I'm the only person who believes a thing. In fact, it's quite a thrilling feeling. But I don't think, and I think that anyone engaged in the business of ideas shouldn't really care about whether they're on the most popular side or not. So what? The history of ideas, history is filled with people who had an unpopular idea at the time, which turned out to be true. So I am privileged in that regard. I don't take it lightly. As regards, the particular issue you raise, I wrote about that in The Madness of Crowds, and I've sort of said everything I have to say about the trans issue. But I do believe that there are times when, things explode and people behave in a certain way, and you have to decide how you counter that. But, I do believe that old thing that if you stare into the abyss too long, the abyss stares back into you. And you can become the thing you hate. And I do worry about that. I can be fairly acerbic when needed.
When needed. That's the key thing, yes?
And always invite people to put anything they think to me at their peril. But I do also believe that where possible, one should exhibit courtesy. I think it's the only way. We live in highly pluralistic societies. There's no way we're all going to agree. There's no way. On issue after issue, there's no way everyone in this room is going to agree on anything, let alone everyone across the entire United States. There's no way. So we have to be able to talk to each other, and we have to try to understand each other. And one thing to do in that is to try to start from the assumption that the other person does believe what they're saying, and test them on it if you can, but not to just assume that they're lying, and much more. And a man I had an enormous amount of respect for, Kenneth Clark, Lord Clark of Civilization, as he was known, who did the television series Civilization in the 70s. He said at the end of that series, he said that if he could sum up civilization in one word, it would be the word courtesy. I've always thought that's a touching and beautiful insight. And a lot of people in this country used to recognize that, you know. If it's lost, we must regain it. You can't give in to bullies, but nor should you become one yourself.
There was a time where someone like you would come and speak in Richmond, and tomorrow there would be an article in the newspaper, and perhaps on Sunday people would talk about having attended the lecture, and that would be the end of it. Tonight, there will probably be 200 people who will post pictures with you and will offer their personal
200?
commentary. The rest of them will go to bed.
I was going to
go to the bar.
a whiskey at
Yes.
some point. Jesus.
But with the advent of social media, everybody has a voice. And how do you analyze the current social media status in the United States and how that is or is not driving our dialogue?
Well, it's dementing everyone, obviously. I mean, can you imagine at the end of the 20th century if we'd been sitting, let's say we'd been sitting here in 1999, and you said, look, there's this amazing new tool we've all got, the internet, and the idea is anyone can read and learn anything. You say, wow, imagine the things we're going to do in the 21st century. That's fantastic. You mean I can speak to somebody in Botswana by Skype video and we don't have to travel to meet each other? We can just talk? Yes. And we can learn from each other? Yes. Wow, we're going to solve so many things. Fast forward to 2022, we don't know what a woman is.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me in lots of ways we've become demonstrably stupider. And I, for one, regret this enormously because I think of the opportunity cost. And I say to, a lot of young people are getting off the worst platforms, but I often say to people that they should be careful with these platforms. They are very addictive. First of all, there needs to be more humility. People now seem to think they have an opinion, they have to have an opinion on absolutely everything. You don't. You don't. You can say, this isn't my area, I've not looked into it, I can't be an expert on all of history, all domestic policy, Afghan withdrawals, ivermectin, masks, COVID, Chinese laboratories, CCP, Russia, Ukraine. It's just like...
Well, try hosting a radio show. You don't get to say that. It's Google it in the morning at 6 a.m. Be an expert at 6:20.
It's nice that he's so honest about it. But I love the comedian Norm Macdonald, and I love the thing he said once. He said, when I was a boy, he said, like, people had about 5 or 6 opinions. And if there was somebody who had like 8 opinions, you go, God, he's an opinionated guy. He's not much fun. Now everyone has to know everything.
This was my elegant way of segueing into where we're about to open up questions from the audience. So we have folks who have the microphones. If you want to speak, I'm going to let you think about what you want to ask, and these young ladies will come and greet you with the microphone. But let me ask you another question while people are formulating their question. One thing you said to me on Thursday that I thought was really interesting was that you thought we as Americans are losing our confidence in ourselves. What makes you say that for folks who didn't hear the interview, and what is the solution?
Well, there's a prominent historian I knew a bit who died recently, Paul Johnson. Paul wrote a history of the American people that came out in 1999. The opening line of the book, which was a huge bestseller at the time, some of you may have it on your shelves, the opening line of the book is, quote, "The creation of the United States of America is the greatest of all human adventures." Can you imagine a history of the American people opening with that sentence 20 years later? No. It's almost laughable to even think of it. You would have to start with a mea culpa and much more. One thing I really, as I said, I admire this country and its people enormously, but I wish that there was a greater understanding of the fact that history was hell for almost everyone. Almost everyone. It was just, look at the figures for deaths in London in the 17th century. Like, people died of sudden death, and the cause of death would just be put as drowning or the pox or just any number of things. And an average mill worker in the north of England in the 1860s lived to the age of 37. History was pretty hell for everyone. And everyone's history has dark corners, God knows. How could it not? But it also, in every country, has something great. And in certain countries has things that are truly great. And you can tell, by the way, and I slightly mentioned this in my book on migration and Europe, but you can tell because of the footfall. It's one of the things I beg Americans to consider. The footfall goes one way. Boats leave the North African continent, the north of the African continent, to go to southern Mediterranean Europe. They do not meet boats going the other way. Boats go from France to England. They do not go the other way. The footfall into America, this country has an issue with the border crisis, a huge issue, and it's one they must get on top of. But just consider the fact that we are running two programs simultaneously in our heads in America. A, we are a deeply racist, terrible country that's been bad from the beginning. Two, the whole world wants to come here. When the people crossing Eagle Pass do not meet people from Texas trying to break into Venezuela. And it's a serious thing to consider that. It means you're doing something right.
Well, I do want to hear from our audience, and I saw a gentleman come into the microphone, so we'll start on this side and then I'll bounce over to the other side. Raise your hand up after this question if you'd like to join in.
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. You started talking about iconoclasm, and I remember the first time I heard that word. I was a young boy in Sunday school. I had a pretty good Sunday school teacher, I remember, and he talked about iconoclasm and when the Byzantine church outlawed icons, and they painted over the icons and went to monasteries and smashed up the icons, and many years later, I can't remember, hundreds maybe, the icons came back. I believe history always repeats itself. I mean, we're in a period that's kind of grim, it seems, but you think they're coming back anytime soon, or it will be hundreds of years?
Well, I think we're in a period of overcorrection, and it's a question of the pendulum swinging back to a normal position, I do believe that in the estimation of the American past, we're in the process of trying to find an equilibrium between a story that used to be told and one that is being told at the moment. There's no reason why we cannot land at a reasonable estimation of the past. And I hope very much that we do. But there are certain things then that must be challenged. For instance, slavery is a terrible human evil, and this country did engage in it. But it is not the American story. Britain was engaged in slavery, but it is not the British story. Almost every civilization in the world engaged in slavery, but it is not the sole story of those nations. And when I hear people saying, for instance, consider the mainstreaming of the following claim, that America has an original sin. It's a very interesting claim, that, because it plays on the religiosity of the American public. Gets the American public in a very vulnerable place. But consider that claim. Is it true? It could be true, but you'd have to defend it. And the second question I would ask, if you do believe that, is, what is the original sin of other countries? What is the original sin of, say, Uganda, or Mozambique, or Saudi Arabia, or any other country? What's the original sin of China? I mean, do we all have one? Or is it just America? And if it is just America, then that is an unfair estimation of America. It does not put the American past into an accurate and adequate perspective. Quite the opposite. It deliberately skews it. So I hope we can arrive at an equilibrium, but because of some of the people I'm talking about this evening, it's harder than it should be.
Let's see, on this side, do we have somebody waiting, or? All right, come on up.
Do I need to identify myself?
Well, we'd always love to know who we're talking to.
Yes,
You
it's
should give
Mike.
your pronouns.
It's Mike. Exactly. So I know you're on a tour. Thank you for making this stop. Thank you, John. I want this to sound like a question, but it may come across as a statement.
I think you just put a question mark at the end.
Well, no. But let me say what I want to say. So your assessment of civility is so appropriate. So appropriate. But let me kind of respond to then maybe where we were and how we got here and how we deal with that element or elements. Malcolm X is on record as saying, if you think the American left is the savior for black people, you're desperately wrong. Now, I may have editorialized a bit. I don't think so. Systematically, and you can go back to Woodrow Wilson or before and coming forward, it's been a very strategic, planned approach to do all the things you addressed and spoke to. So where do we go from here? I mean, civility can carry the day, but then what you recounted about what happened here in Richmond, I mean, where did these people come from? They're not from here, and it allowed to be happened. And if you speak up, so civility can carry the day, but that element, huge element, financed as they are doing significant damage to this country.
I agree with that.
Okay.
But I mean, consider the fact that
What I said is more of a statement than a question.
yeah, sure.
But please.
Normally in that situation, what you say is, "Do you agree?" It's fine. No.
So
I wasn't actually trying to provoke you to go on.
How do you properly respond?
I'll explain. First of all, there's several options always. I mean, one is, for instance, when institutions are taken over, you have two options. One is to take them back, and another is to start new institutions. And this country has a very rich history of both those occupations. When it comes to, as it were, people of violence, well, one of the images from 2020 that's often been in my mind is a photograph from Britain of when people started pulling down statues in the UK in imitation of the movement that was going on in America. There were people like the founder of the Boy Scouts, Baden-Powell. His statues started being attacked. Why? Because he was a Victorian and he had some Victorian ideas, which people in Victorian England did have. That's true. If Baden-Powell had been born in the year 2000 and had Victorian views, that would be strange. But he was a man of his time, as everybody is, as we all are, as they were. For some reason, Baden-Powell came into the purview of the mobs. And one of the statues of him was going to be pulled down somewhere in the south of England. And an elderly lady had stood beside it with a piece of paper saying British history matters. And actually nobody pulled it down. I thought it was a very touching demonstration of bravery by somebody who did not need to be brave. But what I always urge in this situation is there is a tendency of people to think that they have to carry out acts of suicidal bravery, as it were, in response. And I don't think they do. I think that all that needs to happen in America is everybody in America takes one step forward. Just takes one step forward.
We're trying to encourage that every morning on the radio, to be honest with you.
And one of the things is to say this. You have your holy places, and we have ours. You have your holy ideas, we have ours. If you want me to respect your past, you need to respect mine. And if you expect me to respect your ancestors, but you totally disrespect mine, the deal is off.
I am watching the clock, but I saw you come down the aisle.
I'll be quick. My name's Ann Tatus, and I am a Chesterfield County parent. And I have a master's in geopolitical war history of the 20th century. And so from Hungary, Lukács, and Italy, Gromsky, and then you bring, the Bolsheviks, Mao, hypersexualization of children, the separation of Judeo-Christian values, parents from their children, is that we've seen it happen for even just 100 years. Mao. At what point do we see it happening, and do we stop ignoring that history is repeating itself and we know the outcome? And that's not even mentioning Stalin or Hitler. Is at what point or how do we actually start to point out that we are literally watching them use what's been done for 100 years?
Well, somebody said earlier history repeats itself. I prefer that version, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. You hear unpleasant echoes of the past, for sure. Anyone who knows their history knows that. You hear a terrible rhyme in the air. I think it's often about what people think they can get away with. A lot of terrible behavior from the past, when we look back at it, we think, why did people let them get away with it? Why didn't they stop it there? And that's the challenge we're all in now in America, in all the Western countries, is why don't we stop it there? Like, why don't we stop it when it's not about teaching equality, but it's about teaching vengeance? Why don't we stop it when, instead of saying, it's acceptable to talk badly about one racial group because another racial group was talked about badly before, we say, no, we don't want people to be broken along these lines. We don't want that kind of talk, not from any direction. We don't hear about guilty children, children born into sin because of their race. It's horrible any way you do that. That's the sort of place you draw a line. And it's way before it gets to the kind of situation you describe. But it's there. It's in the idea of you're predestined because of things you have no control over. That's the place to stop it, wherever it comes from.
All right, on this side.
Yes, this is for John. I just want to say thank you for being a true Southern gentleman.
You're very kind. Thank you. Well, let's just keep on going, yes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Rick Tangard. I would imagine that most of the people in this room and a significant portion of the general population would agree with what's been said here this evening. But when we look around at the dominant narrative, the people with their hands on the levers of power in academia and business, and certainly in almost all portions of the media, the dominant narrative is very different. How do we deal with that? In my own experience, a couple of years ago, I had a lengthy correspondence with the publisher of the local newspaper, and told him that, you know, for the first time in my life, I'm ready to live in a house without the newspaper, because the newspaper that I've read for many, many years and have been published in many times as letters to the editor has gone off the rails. And, you know, how do we deal with that? I hope for optimism, but I really see a lot of reason to, you know, be skeptical.
How do you reclaim the society? Yeah.
I mean, one option is to buy a different newspaper. I'm totally serious. I mean, if one newspaper lets you down, you move to another one, you let the paper that you've left know. The Spectator is the answer to all questions. Thank you to the editor in the back. I mean, the media is filled with alternatives. I wish that there wasn't the risk of simply falling. I wish we had a sort of common news narrative, but, you know, we don't at the moment. I wish we could reclaim it. I wish the papers that used to be papers of record still were.
They've jettisoned that.
Thank you.
And then I'm seeing 3 more questions.
I'll try to do them quickly so that
Yes.
we can take them all.
John? You in?
My name's Casey, and my pronouns are he, him, and I'm wearing a blue shirt. You've written about the strange death of Europe, largely due to demographic changes and immigration, and a lot has happened since then. We've had a pandemic, there's a war there, energy crisis. Has anything changed about your projections for Europe, and how much time does it have left?
I moved to America. I said I'd be brief. ...
Is it that ominous, you think, in Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe? The war aside?
The war aside, I mean, in Britain we have an inflation at 10.5%, down from 10.7 last quarter. I mean, there's a bad cost of living crisis here, but it's even worse there. I think opportunities for young people in Europe are far worse than they are in America.
Is that because you pulled out of the EU?
No, it's the same across the EU.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at youth unemployment in Italy and Spain and Portugal, it's just heartbreaking. I could go on, but I'm conscious that we've got.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ortuno. Douglas, thank you so much for coming to Richmond, Virginia. John, you're the best. Tagging along one of the speakers that was here before me, but more on a simpler level, how do we get our youth back on track? How do we, looking at the audience, I think we're all on the same side. I don't know how many people I invited who aren't on the same side, and they're not here. So, John, you had a
You
great...
invited people tonight who would not have necessarily agreed with our show in the morning and
They live in
and his book?
Richmond, and as soon as they saw monuments down...
Interesting, yeah. That's disappointing. I
It
would have
is.
enjoyed that too. Okay.
It is.
Yeah.
And one thing you had on your show, John, was One Small Step. I thought that was kind of intriguing, but you might be able to explain it better. But it sort of helped us to start talking again, which might, I don't know, do something. As far as I can see, we're all kind of just so polarized. I mean, it's great we're all here, but we're on the same team.
Is there a
It's
civilized
like-
way to
Yeah.
bridge that
Oh yeah,
gap?
there is, and I really, really urge people
And the youth, too.
engage in it. I mean, just very quickly, let me give an example. A few years ago, there was a group in Australia and New Zealand who asked if I'd come and do a tour, and I said, yeah, of course. And they said, we kind of envisage a best of enemies tour. As in they had the Buckley-Vidal debates in their head. And I said, well, did you see the Buckley-Vidal debates? You do know how they ended, don't you? I said, look, this was about 2017 or so. It was about a year or two into Trump. I said, it seems to me that, firstly, by the way, that doesn't work technically, because night 1 is horrible, night 2 is vicious, night 3 doesn't happen. And I said, can we try something else? Why don't we look for somebody who I admire and admires me, but who don't agree on anything? almost nothing at any rate. And I was really proud of this idea, and they went away, and it wasn't easy to find somebody. But the person they came back with, and who I then spent 2 weeks with touring down under, was Dr. Cornel West, then at Princeton. And we had one of the most transformative and moving experiences of my life, because Professor West describes himself as a revolutionary Christian socialist, and I do not. And he has radically different views from me on almost everything, from religion to politics to foreign affairs to everything else. But I said to him at the beginning, I said, I think the most important thing is not that we we avoid disagreement, we shouldn't avoid disagreement, but that we show that people can disagree and still get on, still speak. It shouldn't be the case that a Republican and a Democrat can't sit down at the same table, or a Trump voter and a non-Trump voter can't. It shouldn't be like that in America. You know, one of the people who is most quoted, de Tocqueville, says what is most interesting about America is the way in which in the public square people get together and have things out. And it is quite hard to find people willing to do that. But Professor West and I got on in part because we'd drunk from the same wells, you know, educationally, historically. He's got his own ideas and different things he added to it. But I said to him at the end of the tour, I said, that was wonderful. It was like playing jazz, because we both had the same theme in common, but we could riff in different ways. I wish that there was more of that.
Let's do 2 or 3 more. I'm watching the clock, and I'm looking in the back, and we're trying to wrap up. Yeah. So John, real quick, and then.
Okay, a lot of people think what's happening today is kind of crazy, the wokeness, et cetera, that something's wrong with people, they're kind of deranged. But I think we need to go back and remember something that Michelle Obama said in 2008 during the campaign at a public meeting in South Carolina. She said, Obama knows we have to change our history. He knows we have to change our traditions. And that goes hand in hand with Obama intending to fundamentally transform America, as he proclaimed 5 days before the election was over. What's happening is not willy-nilly, people get crazy. What's happening, there's an agenda behind it. There is a plan and intentionality behind it. It's part of the Marxist cultural revolution that intends to tear down the country and its values and traditions, and in a Leninist manner build up something else. But aside from the statement, I have a question. That is, Mr. Murray, thank you so much. We really appreciate and respect and admire what you're saying. Profound. I wanted to ask you, you were down, apparently, you were at UVA, and I guess in North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about your experience with the students there and some of the faculty and how it went. Was there any civility? Was there non-civility? Did you make any progress with people?
I found everybody enormously courteous. I was very pleased. I was very pleased by it. Met wonderful faculty. Met some wonderful students. You know, the smarter students, I think, are finding their own way through this.
Is that the majority of the students?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I just know, and this is my experience of recent years, is that the smarter ones of every background are finding their way through this. They don't like the thing they're being fed. You can't... I talk a little bit in this book about... Bear with me for a moment, I know we've got some more questions that will come, but I talk a little bit in this book about resentment. Resentment is one of the most devastating things that a person can suffer from. And here's a challenge. I think you probably all would recognize this. I bet everybody in this room knows somebody who has, from the outside, got a lot, materially, or in their life seems to be quite privileged, blessed, or whatever, who is eaten up by resentment. And I bet that most people in this room, if not everyone, at some point in their life, has met somebody who has very little or almost nothing, and is not resentful. Now, resentment, my point is something you can acquire whatever your situation in life. It is an attitude you can slip into. But there is an alternative to resentment, and the alternative is gratitude. To feel grateful is the antidote to resentment. And very resentful people, people immersed in resentment, tend not to do well in their lives. They don't do well in their relationships. They don't do well in their jobs. They don't achieve anything because always there's other people to blame. And they will never accept that crucial thing, which is that there is somebody to blame. It's themselves. But people who feel gratitude, they get on in their lives. And I think smart young Americans of every background want to get on in their lives. They don't want to be held back.
The lady in charge says one more question,
Okay,
so we'll go to this question here, this gentleman.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Christopher Smith. I heard about the event through listening to John Reed in the morning. I am from 32 Square Mile Island. The history there is, the instruction in school is not very strong, especially American, even Caribbean history. From there, I ended up in Washington, D.C. And through music and photography, I've traveled the world a lot. And at 36 years old, I take the middle path now with a lot of things, whether it's politics, whether it's religion, relationships. And in 2017, I came to Richmond, and I immediately came into contact with the debate over the statues. And through assignments and just through my own being compelled to pick up the camera and be present, I was photographing at the time. They were considered neo-Confederates that came down from Tennessee to protect Robert E. Lee statue. And through many, being present at many rallies and protests around the statues, I built up the courage to have conversations with, I had never seen anybody fly a Confederate flag or even enter into a heavily populated place with an automatic rifle. So that was very new and intimidating to me, but through a conversation with a guy that came down here, he advised me, he reminded me of my ignorance of the Civil War, but he also advised me to read on the individuals themselves, Stonewall, Robert E. Lee. And that has led me to Charles City County. I've been documenting Charles City County, historical county, for the last 3 years. I've had some incredible relationships that I end up in harsh debates here in Richmond about. But reading about Robert E. Lee specifically, it was one book, Lee Considered by Alan T. Nolan, that led me down another path with Robert E. Lee. But what I struggle with, I don't have any confirmed opinion about this, was reading about his letters in 1860 to his wife, about slavery, about religion, about everything, and even about after the war in 1866, he was several proposals to come back to certain events to honor the soldiers, the fallen soldiers. He refused. 1866, he had several offers to put up statues in his name. Also, it might be common knowledge now, but he also refused those because he believed that
he didn't actually want them to go up.
Yeah, he didn't want them to go up, and because he believed it was specifically in the context of that time that it would keep the sores of war open, and that tension would always bubble up to the surface. And it was kind of a prophecy to me, to see, and I've read about certain times also in Richmond that conversation about the statues have come up. But I was here to be present in the last couple of years to see the unrest here. And I do not agree with the methods in which they came down, but my question is, what I struggle with is that he specifically did not want that statue to go up, and it became one, I believe, the largest statue in the country to go up for him. So taking it down, you know, taking race and your opinion of the Civil War out of it, is it respectful to take it down because he did not want it down? And is it disrespectful to put it up the largest one in his image? Is it not respectful to keep it down because kind of his prophecy is bubbling up all the time over and over?
I mean, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. It's one that we're obviously living through. I mean, I think the story of Lee, one reason, I mean, again, if local people actually want to take down a statue, I sort of think it's their right to do so. But one reason why I think that it's a mistake to erase Lee is just the enormous complexity of him as a person that will not be learned about if he is just not in the American landscape at all. I mean, when I was speaking with Horn, his biographer, about him, this country, as I say this carefully, this is the sort of thing that somebody quotes out of context wildly, but this country does owe Lee an awful amount, because if he had not surrendered and had done what some others wanted and dispersed the armies and continued a guerrilla war, it is perfectly possible the United States would have fallen apart. And to have ended up conceding was not inevitable. To have decided to use his retirement for a positive good was not inevitable. On all these things, we're all torn. We all have our own views, which, as you say, they sort of evolve as we see things go on and as we read and learn more. Maybe you'll finish on this, but there's a quote from Milan Kundera, the distinguished Czech writer, that I always have in my head. Kundera said, in a book of his from the post-Cold War period, Testaments Betrayed, he said, in our lives, humankind, we walk and operate in a fog. We stumble along a trail in the path, and we create the trail as we walk. That's not the striking thing. Kundera says, the striking thing is that when we look back, we see the man, we see the path, but we don't see the fog. In hindsight, everything looks so clear. Like everybody knows that they would have been anti-Hitler in the 1930s and 40s. Like, the number of people who would have assassinated Hitler in hindsight is like everybody in the world. But at the time, people didn't know that. I mean, some people could see it coming and they warned like anything, like Churchill. But I think one of the things that as mature adults we learn in our lives, and what gives us some of the non-certainty that febrile youth can have, is the knowledge that you don't know anything as you're going through it, and that you just have to step as wisely and as carefully as you can. And the request to be kindly to the past, to try to understand it, is wise because it's a preemptive request to our successors to be kind to us. Because one of the things that you can guarantee with 100% certainty is that just as our ancestors did things that we think are crazy or wicked or evil, how did people enslave other human beings? Why did the Victorians stick children up chimneys? You're not meant to stick children up chimneys, didn't they know? It's a bizarre thing to do. But we know that now, but my point is, since every age in history, people did things that are dumbfounding to their successors, assume that we are not uniquely morally better than everyone in the past, and we are probably doing things now that our successors will look at and think, what were they thinking in the 2020s? And something I would advocate, and it's a positive note perhaps, but I would advocate is, it's much better to work out what we might be doing now and stop doing that than to go back centuries ago and stand as judge, jury, and executioner on everyone who went before us. And I can give one precise example of this. about the exertion of energy in a beneficial way. There are in the world today, I mentioned this in the War in the West, there are estimated to be 30 million human beings who are slaves. 30 million, which is, by the way, more than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. In my travels in Africa and elsewhere and in the Middle East, I've met people born as slaves. It's a terrible, terrible thing to even imagine this is going on. But here's a question we should address. What is a better use of our time in America in the 21st century? To rip ourselves apart, to talk about reparations and DNA tests and finding out that, what's her name, Miss Davis turns out to be...
The Mayflower.
Miss Davis turns out that she would need to both give money and take money, but I don't know which pocket the money goes in. But what would be a better use of our time? To do that and to rip ourselves apart as a nation, or to end the evil of slavery in our day?
Well, you know, I think on that note of maturity and wisdom and foresight, we should end tonight. And will you please join me in thanking Douglas Murray for being here?
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.